So earlier today, Apple went ahead and announced a lot of new hardware at their event. iPad Pros, the MacBook Air was updated, which is actually somewhat exciting to me. I'm really glad to see that particular laptop updated. But the one I want to focus on, the upgrade that I wanted to focus on today, is the Mac Mini. And the reason is, it is, at least for the hardware that you're getting, in a desktop computer, because it is still a desktop computer, even if it is very small and compact. It's a terrible value for the end consumer, so I want to look a little bit at that. What I want to focus on today is actually the Mac Mini, because it is a desktop computer, and yes, I fully understand it's an extremely small and portable desktop computer, but it is still a desktop computer that requires all the external peripherals, and it's just not a good value for the end consumer. And we're going to compare it to what you could put together yourself for a much cheaper cost, even brand new, than the Mac Minis that were just announced. So let's go ahead and move over to the desktop and take a look at this. So on the left side here, we have the quad-core 3.6 gigahertz i3 base system, and then on the right side is the base configuration for the i5 6-core version of these computers. And just off the top, we can already see that they're not going to be a great value, because we're looking at this i3, and it is a $800 PC for a computer with 8 gigabytes of RAM, a 128 gigabyte PCIe based SSD, and an i3 processor with no dedicated graphics. Now, again, I fully understand the Mac Mini is not typically targeting the sort of desktop crowd. It's targeting almost a minimalist crowd that needs some external peripherals, external monitor, or at least wants that sort of experience, but is looking for a very clean setup, a very minimalist setup, and potentially in this case, not exactly a powerful setup. But if you can find room for the other things like your monitor, keyboard, and mouse, I really think that most people can find space for a typical micro ATX or even mini ITX system could be built for cheaper than this, and you could save a lot of money and still have a pretty minimalist setup. All that being said, I'm going to be going for the cheapest build possible to show you just how really cheap this hardware can be had for and put together into a functioning system, and how many hundreds of dollars you can save here. So let's start with the i3 system, just the absolute base system. So this i3 processor is basically an i3-8100. They don't specifically list that as the processor part, but just looking at the clock speed, that looks like what's happening here. So we have an i3-8100. We have a very cheap motherboard, and I actually wouldn't recommend this BioStar board just because I've never had great experiences with BioStar boards. But you can get a similar board for, $5 to $10 more. So that's not going to be a big issue on this front. We have 8 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM at 2666 megahertz, which is exactly what we're seeing from the Mac Mini. If we go down, we have that 128 gigabyte SSD. We actually have a 128 gigabyte NVMe drive here from Patriot for $37. Going on further down, we have a gigabit Ethernet port, and I'll just go ahead and double check to make sure. And yes, our motherboard does have a gigabit Ethernet port as well. And outside of that, there's really nothing else to this system. So if we go to the total system here, I did put it in a very cheap Rosewill case. I've actually worked with a case, the Ranger, which is one of these Rosewill FBM cases. The internal layout actually gives you a lot of flexibility with adding a graphics card, which is one of the reasons I like this case, other than the fact that it is just so dirt cheap, but it's actually somewhat easy to work inside of. You can get this hardware, so the base hardware for this Mac Mini, for about $322.62. So that is just ridiculously cheaper than the Mac Mini base pricing of $800. You're saving more than you're spending by building a similar system yourself. Now, obviously, one of the big drawbacks here is if you want to get onto the Mac operating system, Hackintoshes are not complete idiot-proof processes here. That can be a little bit complicated, but if you're willing to dive into looking at Hackintosh forums and looking at compatible parts lists and figuring out how the operating system works when you're putting it together yourself and doing a lot of that extra legwork, then you are able to actually get into a Mac operating system. It does require quite a bit of research to go from not knowing anything about a Hackintosh to actually putting one together and getting one functioning. but definitely a possibility. So while we're here, let's go ahead and look at some of these upgrade costs that are available if you're purchasing a Mac Mini. You can actually go to the i7 version of this computer on the base model here for a $300 charge. Now, for reference, an 8700K by itself on Amazon is $370, and the i3-8100 on Amazon is $130, so you should actually only be looking at an upgrade cost of $240 if we're talking purely about swapping one part for another. But Apple is charging $300 because, well, why not? And if we look down at RAM, it's much more egregious actually, because you can upgrade to 16 gigabytes for $200 over the 8 gigabyte base capacity. Again, you can buy 8 gigabytes of RAM for $72. So that upgrade should not be anywhere near that expensive. If we go down to the SSD, you can get a upgraded SSD. You can double your capacity for $200, which again is a very steep price to pay. And oddly enough, getting the 10 gigabit Ethernet port over the 1 gigabit version is actually somewhat reasonable, especially compared to some of these other upgrades. For only $100 extra, you can go to a 10 gigabit Ethernet port. And what we're left with there is a very, very overpriced product. So $800 for the complete base model, and a lot of these charges are going to very quickly drive that cost over the $1,000 mark if you're willing to take them. So let's go back and look at the i5 system now. And now looking at the i5 system, which also is a very high price tag for just the base model, starting at $1,100. We've swapped out parts on the right side here from the PC part picker list that I had going, and our cost went up to $420 for an extremely comparable system. So to run down the specs real quick, starting with that 6-core i5 processor, that would be an i5-8500 for $210. We're keeping basically everything else the same except doubling our storage to 256 gigabytes of SSD space, which we did over here with a Patriot Scorch NVMe drive 256 gigabyte version, which is where we drove up our cost to $420 or $452 if you're not willing to jump through the hoops of getting rebates. So again, looking at some of these upgrades on the left side here of this Mac Mini, $200 to go to an i7 processor, which is, to be fair to Apple, a lot more reasonable of an upgrade cost. Going from a $200 i5 to a $370-ish i7, that upgrade fee isn't quite as bad as it was going from the i3 to the i7. Again, RAM costs are the same, as well as the storage costs are $200 to double your 256 to 512. Again, that's a little bit too steep of a cost in my opinion. And then, of course, software is also expensive. So this one starts at $1,100. And again, if you're getting some of these upgrades, you're very quickly going to climb to the $1,500 mark. By just upgrading to an i7 and doubling your RAM, for example, you already be at $1,500. So these Mac Minis, the whole point here, if you're looking for a desktop computer, the Mac Mini is not a good value under any circumstances. Now, if it's what you're looking for, maybe it just fits your aesthetic, or maybe you just really want the simplicity of getting on the Apple operating system for about as cheap as you possibly can, then sure, the Mac Mini may make sense from a desktop's perspective. I'm going to go over here real quick and look at the base cost. So yeah, the base costs of the iMacs are considerably more expensive than the base cost of a Mac Mini. And I think that's where a lot of their sales are going to happen, with people just trying to get onto the Mac operating system for about as cheap as they can. The Mac Mini is where that may sort of find its little bit of a niche. I would not recommend it to literally anyone. I really feel strongly that if you are looking for a desktop computer, even if it doesn't look great, you'd be much better served in your wallet. And as far as upgradability, same thing, by just going ahead and finding space for a slightly larger tower, like, actually not even a slightly larger tower, a significantly larger tower, like a micro ATX case, which is not a giant tower by any means. Obviously, compared to a Mac Mini, almost any desktop computer is going to be large. But if you're buying a desktop computer, you might as well go ahead, put it together yourself, and save a whole lot of money by doing so. because this particular product has a very heavy Apple tax on it. But of course, I do want to hear from you guys. I do not talk about Apple products a whole lot. I have a MacBook Pro personally, but I don't even really use them outside of work very much. So I do want to hear from you. What do you think about the new hardware that Apple just launched, specifically with the Mac Mini? Is it something you would ever even consider buying? Or would you go the route that I suggested in just building your own PC? Let me know down below. And of course, if you like this video and you want to see more like it, give it a like, share, subscribe, comment. All those things help out a lot. You can follow me on Instagram and on Twitter at Hoosier Hardware. And as always, I'll let YouTube queue up a couple more videos from my channel for you to watch. I'm Shane from Hoosier Hardware, and I'll see you guys in the next video.